12th of July, 2000. A German holiday flight from Crete suddenly crash lands in a field near Vienna and raises tons of shocking questions. First, the flight was bound for Hanover. Vienna wasn't even on its route. How did it reach there? Second, the flight slid through mud, tilted dangerously with its nose in the air. But all 151 people survived. Miracle for sure, but how did they make it? And third, the investigation showed that the plane ran out of fuel mid-air. Why? Initially, it started with something so small, a landing gear that refused to retract after takeoff. But that tiny glitch would spiral into a full-blown crisis. For hours, the cockpit was filled with confusion, alarms, and one crucial misunderstanding. In the end, both engines shut down mid-air, and the reason behind it would shake aviation safety protocols forever. This is the unbelievable story of Hapag-Lloyd Flight 3378, the flight that ran out of fuel because of a misunderstood manual. It started as a bright, ordinary morning on the island of Crete. The German holidaymakers of Flight 3378 were ready to go home. The blue and orange Airbus A310 of Hapag-Lloyd stood gleaming under the sun at Chania Airport. The flight carried 143 passengers, 8 crew, including 2 pilots. In the cockpit sat 56-year-old Captain Wolfgang Arminger and his young first officer, Thorsten Ruckrath. The captain was a veteran, a legend in his company. He had more than 23,000 flight hours. On the contrary, the first officer was new, still learning, but calm and careful, so they had no reason to expect trouble. When the clock struck 9 in the morning, the flight rolled down the runway and took off. The climb was smooth into the bright Greek sky, but seconds later something went wrong. The pilots tried to retract the landing gear, which is a routine procedure after a successful takeoff. But the gear didn't move, it was stuck, and the warning lights flashed red across the cockpit. The captain tried cycling the gear again, but nothing happened. It wasn't an emergency yet. The Airbus could still fly safely with its wheels down, but there was one problem: drag. The open landing gear slowed the aircraft, burned more fuel, and limited its speed, so they'd have to check if they could still make it home. Captain Arminger asked his first officer to contact the company, but the long-range radio wasn't working either, so Thorsten used a slower system, a CARS. It lets the pilot type messages back and forth with the airline dispatchers, like sending text messages over the sky. But as I just said, it's painfully slow. While Thorsten typed, the captain studied the flight management system. The digital screens showed how much fuel they had and how much they'd need. And the numbers didn't look good. The computer said they wouldn't have enough to reach Hanover, and it's dangerous. Clearly, they needed another plan. After some messages, the dispatcher suggested Stuttgart. But the captain said no. They picked Munich instead because it was closer and safer. The dispatcher said again, if things got worse, go to Vienna instead. Once backup airports were allotted, the first officer opened the manual. It had a chart for flying with the gear down, showing how much extra fuel would burn at different altitudes. But it only went up to 27,000 feet, while they were already flying at 31,000. So the chart didn't help, but Captain Arminger simply waved it off. The computer can handle it, he said. But if it really could, we probably won't have to make this video today. The flight management system didn't know the gear was still out. For that reason, it didn't factor in the extra drag, and that's why the number on the screen for expected fuel on board looked safe. But it was wrong. The system thought they'd have more fuel left than they actually would. And the pilots never realized that even Munich was already out of reach for them. At first, the computer showed they'd have 3.3 tons left on arrival. That's plenty. But at 9:57 in the morning, Thorsten checked the actual fuel. Turned out, they'd burned 60% more than planned. That was alarming. Still, they thought it made sense. Climb burns more fuel and cruise burns less. So they thought things would balance out later. But they were wrong. The number on the screen slowly dropped. 3.3 tons, 2.5, 2.0. The captain frowned. Regulations always say they need at least 1.9 tons left after landing, but this flight was already running on 2 tons of fuel mid-air. How was it possible? But the pilots had no time to think about it, so he immediately changed the destination to Vienna. The computer said they'd arrive with 2.6 tons. That's a safe margin. For the time being, the captain felt better. Even to save more fuel, he asked air traffic control for shortcuts. Each time the plane got a more direct route, the computer showed higher fuel left. So it looked stable again, at 2.6 tons. But the truth was different, and the real fuel was disappearing fast. As they passed near Zagreb, they were just 10 minutes from the airport. They could have landed there easily, but the captain again said no. The reason? At Vienna airport, they had their company's staff and maintenance personnel. At Zagreb, there's none. So they flew on, but the fuel prediction dropped again. At 10:34, it fell below 1.9 tons. Now it was serious. The captain called Vienna and asked for a priority landing. What's strange is that he still didn't declare an emergency. Even the first officer reminded him that they should because the rules said so. But Captain Arminger hesitated. He didn't want to make a fuss, and he believed they would make it. It was a deadly gamble he was playing in expense of 151 lives. The flight started descending from 31,000 feet, about 267 kilometers away. Every second, fuel drained faster. And at around 11:01 in the morning, the low fuel warning light glowed across the cockpit, requesting the pilots to land immediately. At 11:07, the captain finally declared a fuel emergency, but his voice was calm. "We'll make Vienna safely," he told air traffic control. He didn't ask for fire trucks, he didn't sound afraid at all, but the first officer was. Graz Airport in Austria was closer, 55 kilometers nearer. He suggested they go there instead. But again, the captain refused. "We're already lined up with Vienna," he said. "Turning might waste time." The first officer gave a reluctant nod. Now, locked on the Vienna approach, they couldn't request more shortcuts. The fuel reading fell fast. 1 ton, half a ton, even less. The captain stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. He even muttered that the system must have changed something. And that's when the first officer spilled the secret softly. "It doesn't count the drag. The gear, it's not calculating that." But the captain shook his head in disbelief. "No, it can't be that." The first officer didn't argue, because there was no time left. The landscape below them was turning green and gold, the fields of Austria sliding by. Vienna was still ahead, but the engines were dry, running out of fuel. The low fuel light was still on. The cockpit smelled of hot metal. Suddenly, the captain's panicked voice broke the silence. "How much is left?" The first officer checked and said, "Almost nothing." They both knew it now. Vienna might be too far, and they would either land somehow or embrace death in a minute. The passengers didn't know what was happening. To them, it was just another approach, maybe a little noisy, a little rough. But in the cockpit, First Officer Thorsten whispered, "Captain, we might not make it." The radio crackled suddenly. The Vienna approach cleared them to land on runway 34. The city was faintly visible on the horizon, wrapped in haze. The aircraft began its final descent, still heavy, wheels locked down, drag tearing through the air. As the plane dropped below 5,000 feet, the warning lights began to flash again. Fuel pressure low. "Captain, we're losing both engines," Thorsten said again. The captain's hand froze on the throttle. He looked outside, searching for the runway that wasn't there yet. And that's when the first engine died, running out of fuel. The captain was dead silent. Within a minute, the second engine coughed once, then stopped too. The plane wasn't flying at all, it became a glider. The captain pulled back slightly on the controls. Vienna lay just ahead, close enough to see, far enough to lose. The cockpit alarm screamed one last time. Would they make the runway? The Airbus A310, carrying 151 people, was now gliding through the sky with no power, no thrust, and no hope but gravity. They were still 22 kilometers from Vienna's runway. The first officer's voice shook as he grabbed the radio and said,
"Mayday, mayday, mayday! I'm in trouble! Mayday, mayday, mayday!"
Captain Wolfgang Arminger pulled a small lever with all his energy. Under the plane's belly, a metal propeller flipped out into the rushing air. This ram air turbine was their last chance. It spun fast, generating just enough power to move the hydraulics, to steer, to fight. At least. Maybe, just maybe, there were a few drops of fuel left somewhere. He was not wrong, though. The right engine coughed, caught, and then flamed out again. By 11:29, both engines were gone completely, with zero chance of restart. The runway was close. But now they were descending too fast to make it there, and the ground was coming closer faster. Captain Arminger tried to stretch the glide, pulling back on the stick, keeping the nose upward. But it wasn't enough. And then the inevitable happened. The grass field rushed up, the left wingtip hit first, slicing through the dirt. Then the landing gear slammed down and ripped off. The sound was metal screaming against the earth. The plane skidded violently. Dirt and debris flew up past the windows, and it plowed through a line of lights and smashed into an antenna. The left engine dragged against the soil, spraying sparks. Then finally silence. The plane stopped. Its nose was tilted high, leaning to one side like a broken bird. They had made it to Vienna, but not to the runway. It ended up in a deadly, devastating crash. Inside, the passengers screamed, cried, but they couldn't even believe they were alive. Captain Arminger ordered an urgent evacuation. The crew ran to the doors, but the front exits jammed. The left one wouldn't open, and the right one was too steep. The center slides failed too. One punctured, and the other was blown against the fuselage and could not inflate. That left only the rear exit, so one by one passengers climbed out and slid down. Everyone escaped. Luckily, there was no fire, no explosion. Only 26 people were injured. Slightly. If this is not a perfect example of a miracle, what is? The media already called Captain Arminger a hero. The man who landed a powerless plane and saved 151 lives. But the black boxes, they told an entirely different story. When investigators replayed the flight recorders, they found no sudden loss of fuel, no hidden leak. The fuel had just run out slowly, steadily. The plane had never carried enough fuel to reach Vienna in the first place. The captain had trusted the flight management system, the FMS, which predicted enough reserve fuel on arrival. But as the first officer told the captain in the last moment, that system didn't account for one thing: the drag from the landing gear, which had been stuck down since takeoff. The reason for that? A tiny nut. It was installed years ago, but installed wrong. It had slowly unscrewed itself over thousands of hours until the landing gear could no longer retract. That single nut started the chain, and the gear stuck down. The drag increased. Fuel burned faster. And the pilots never realized they were already walking the line. Captain Arminger wasn't reckless. He was experienced, respected. His first officer was also bright, confident. But both were trapped by a quiet flaw, not just in metal, but in understanding. The FMS was treated like a black box. They were simply taught procedure X equals result Y. But they never learned the reason or mechanism behind it. The captain believed it worked like a car computer, showing true range even with a roof rack attached. When the real fuel readings began to drop, the captain didn't panic, because the FMS still said they could reach Vienna. Even when the first officer suggested diverting to Zagreb, the captain refused. Zagreb wasn't a Hapag-Lloyd base, indeed. Landing there would cause chaos, like extra costs, bad press. The media would have painted the captain as a pilot with a questionable decision. Comparatively, Vienna felt much safer. Plus, he believed getting to Vienna was certain by 99%, maybe 100%. But that was a planned continuation bias. It's a mind's trick of sticking to the original goal no matter how the world changes. And it blinded him. After passing Zagreb, they could have gone to Graz. The first officer requested him to divert him, but Arminger said no. He was too focused, too stressed, too deep inside his own mission. If they had turned toward Graz, they would have landed safely with fuel left in the tanks. Even when his co-pilot wondered if the FMS might be wrong, if it wasn't accounting for the drag, Arminger shut him down. Simply because the idea didn't fit the story he believed. And so they pressed on, straight toward Vienna, but as a result, when the fuel vanished, they still had one more chance. 3, actually. 1, if they had flown slower, they would have saved fuel. 2, if they had stayed higher longer, they could have glided further. And 3, if they had flipped one switch on the checklist, land recovery, which is the emergency system that would have powered the flaps and slats. Those flaps could have carried them the final 660 meters to the runway. But none of that happened. Why? Because their documents didn't say it. Neither did their training teach it. The result, the plane crashed in the field. 6 months later, Captain Arminger resigned. He never touched a cockpit again, but peace didn't follow. First, he was no longer a hero. And then Germany charged him with negligence, for flying too far, for trusting the machine blindly, for believing numbers that weren't real. The aviation world split in outrage. Pilots warned that punishing mistakes would make future pilots hide the truth. Investigators also argued that it was the system that was broken, not the man. But the judge didn't see it that way. In 2004, he called Arminger arrogant. He gave him a 6-month suspended sentence and prison time that would hang over his head but not take him away. Even worse, the ruling came before the final accident report was published. That means evidence still pending, facts still unknown. Just think about the irony. A pilot flies with too little fuel and is punished before the truth is known. But a judge sentences before hearing all the facts. Who, then, is truly negligent? Captain Arminger disappeared quietly from the aviation industry, his name buried beneath the wreckage of one wrong assumption. A bigger question remained unanswered by any report. If the captain had trusted his gut instead of the system, would Flight 3378 have landed safely? But the story didn't end there. It had taken almost 6 years of questions, courtroom arguments, and silence. Then finally, in March 2006, the final report on the crash of Hapag-Lloyd Flight 3378 was released. And it was heartbreaking. At the center of it all stood Captain Arminger, a man once painted as a hero, first and then careless and guilty. The judge had sent him to prison, but the report told a different story. It revealed that his mistakes were not born of recklessness, but of the strange tricks the human mind plays under stress. It said the captain's judgment had been clouded by psychological effects, known to affect even the best pilots. His errors were not intentional. They were patterns of human thinking, faulty assumptions that felt true in the moment. The report also spoke of the first officer. Unlike the captain, he made no mistakes. He even went beyond his duties, performing critical tasks without being told. At one point, he figured out the real cause of the crisis on his own. But when he tried to explain it to Arminger, the captain didn't believe him. Still, the report made one thing clear. No one who truly read it could believe that Captain Arminger deserved prison. But just when it seemed the story was closing, something unexpected appeared. 30 pages of defiance from Airbus Industries. And that changed everything. Airbus's response was sharp, almost defensive. They accused the investigators of misunderstanding how the airplane systems worked. Due to this, the investigators had suggested that the flight management system, the FMS, failed to show accurate fuel predictions when the landing gear was down. But Airbus fired back. They said the FMS was never designed to do that in the first place. In other words, they claimed, don't blame the system for not doing something it was never meant to do. So what's going on? Basically, what Airbus said was nothing but corporate precision. But it also missed the heart of the issue. Because if the system wasn't built to warn pilots about fuel consumption when the gear was down, wasn't that itself a problem? After all, the crash had happened because of that very gap. A misunderstanding between what the system did and what the pilot thought it did. Airbus also pointed a finger at the airline. They said Hapag-Lloyd had failed to include key information about fuel use and FMS limitations in their documentation. The checklist for flying with the landing gear extended didn't contain the line, fuel consumption, determine. This single missing line, Airbus argued, could have set the entire disaster in motion. And maybe they were right. Airbus said its own checklist told pilots to look at a manual section, that clearly warned them not to use the FMS's vertical mode when the landing gear was down. In simple terms, Airbus meant that when the landing gear was extended, the computer's fuel calculations couldn't be trusted. But investigators weren't convinced. They noted that nowhere in any manual was vertical mode actually defined. It wasn't clear what it included or didn't include. How could a pilot possibly guess that it also covered fuel predictions? Maybe the warning was there, but the meaning wasn't. It was there like a hidden secret. And that small crack in understanding led to a disaster. Still, Airbus wasn't the only one under scrutiny. The Austrian investigators issued 14 safety recommendations. They demanded that Airbus and the airline fix their manuals, make them crystal clear, and remove all confusion about the FMS's behavior when the landing gear was down. They wanted airlines to retrain pilots, check their escape slides for wind resistance, and make sure all documentation was complete and easy to understand. It was a call for clarity in the skies, in the manuals, and in the minds of those who fly. Only for Captain Arminger, clarity had come too late. But what if something like this happens in your next flight? How would you be sure if your flight is okay or compromised? And after all, who would you blame for things like this? Share your views in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel to know about more aviation disasters and keep track of the best airlines and the worst for your safety.